Hello, freunde, und willkommen. My name is Nate, and thank you so much for joining me today. Now, for the most part, most of us have gone through a history class of some sort throughout our schooling, and we want to believe that everything that we were taught in history was true. And if you watched my live stream last week, then you know that I am a huge history buff. I love history. I love knowing what happened in the past and all the events that took place, and it's just really exciting for me. But I came across a video that is basically 10 historical facts that are false. Now, I'm curious to know if what I learned in school is false, if they lied to me. So I want to know if what I believe or have believed to be true is in fact actually true. So let's just hop into the video and see what it's all about.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching Top 10's Net, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 historical facts that aren't actually true.
Facts.
Number 10. Columbus was the first European to discover America. While this old belief has been largely expunged from the historical record today, at one point it was believed as a fact by generations of schoolchildren and is still maintained as true by some adults even today. Of course, the truth is that the Vikings preceded Columbus by centuries and may have even built small villages in the New World hundreds of years before Columbus was born. Even if that weren't the case, however, from a purely technical perspective, Columbus never actually touched foot onto what is today the United States, spending all of his time in the East Indies. Number 9.
That is true. I remember in grade school or whatever, Christopher Columbus discovered America. No, he didn't. And another fallacy, I believe, and which is why a lot of people want to get rid of Columbus Day, is because he wasn't a very nice person. He was actually a very evil person, and I won't get into all of that. It's beyond the scope of this, but in recent years, decades or whatever, they have found evidence and artifacts from the Vikings in the eastern coast of Canada and the United States. So it's just not true that Christopher Columbus was the first European to set foot on American soil. I did know that one.
People in Columbus's time thought that the world was flat. Closely related to the belief that Columbus discovered America is the belief, again less prevalent today than it was half a century ago, that most people in his day believed the Earth was flat, and if Columbus sailed too far out, he would fall off its edge. In reality, the notion that the Earth was flat had been refuted by the ancient Greeks, who were even able to calculate its circumference with astonishing precision, and so was not held to be a fact by any but the most primitive cultures at the time. Number 8.
The most primitive culture at the time. And yet there's still people who believe the world is flat. Flat earthers. So they must be primitive thinkers. I just don't understand how those people believe the Earth is flat, and they do these experiments for proof that the world is flat. And I watched one video where the guy actually debunked his own theory that the world was flat based on shadow, I believe, looking at a point of light through an instrument, and he said, well, it's flat because when I do this happens, but that didn't happen. And he was, either pretended to be shocked or was sincerely shocked at, oh, there's a curve. I want to believe that those guys really don't believe the world is flat, but instead they're just attention seekers and just want to rile people up. But who knows? There might be people that actually believe the world is flat, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you believe the world is flat. You you are wrong.
Hitler seized power in Germany by force. Many people hold the misconception that the Nazis seized power in Germany, but nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is that the Nazis came to power through free and fair elections, and even used the democratic process to secure that power. In effect, Adolf Hitler, appealing to the very legitimate grievances and fears of the German people, used the ballot box to achieve the powerful position of Chancellor, and then used that very same process to destroy democracy by having the legislature grant him the emergency powers he convinced them was necessary to restore order. Number 7.
That is true. I do know that I can understand why people would think that the Nazis and Hitler took over Germany by force, because they were a force to be reckoned with at the time. But Hitler was actually a very, very good speaker. For being somebody who was an introvert, who was very awkward in social situations when he was younger, he really had a way of speaking and appealing to the common people and playing on their fears, somewhat like what's happening today in the United States and other countries. Maybe not to that degree, but it's really easy to actually play on the fears of people to get them to side with you and to agree that this other class of people or race of people are evil, who want to bring your country down, and you get them riled up, and bad things will happen. So Hitler was actually a very good public speaker, and so it wasn't taken by force. It was through his speeches.
The stock market crash of 1929 started the Great Depression. Of all the misconceptions surrounding that,
this one I actually thought was kind of true. I don't know.
Dark era in American history, the idea that the crash of October 1929 kicked off the Great Depression is the most obstinate. The fact is that the Great Depression was caused by a number of factors, each of which went into making it a deeper and more enduring economic downturn than it would have been otherwise. Instead of letting the market make its own corrections and wait it out, they passed legislation, such as the Smoot-Hawley Act, that raised tariffs on imports, which was designed to make it cheaper to buy American products. The problem is they didn't anticipate that foreign governments would raise tariffs on American goods in response, thereby killing exports and forcing the mass closure of many factories. Bad government policies also caused many banks to fail, wiping out the life savings of millions of Americans, which further exacerbated the problem. Number 6. Japan.
Okay, so that makes sense. It wasn't just the stock market crash, but a number of factors which led up to the Great Depression. I can see that. I did know, that there were a number of choices that were made, or legislative choices made that contributed to that, but I didn't know the extent of it. But it does make perfect sense that not one thing is going to cause it, but a multitude of different factors played into the Great Depression. And, legislative decisions do have consequences. I think a lot of times the political people in power have a very narrow-minded view of things and don't think of the consequences, short-term or long-term, of whatever that they're deciding. So deciding to change the tariffs to make it cheaper for people to buy U.S. goods, while other countries are like, hey, you know what? We'll just raise those prices, and then you can't afford that either. So that makes perfect sense.
Japan had to attack America if it wanted to survive economically. The belief that Japan was largely forced into attacking the United States because of the crippling embargo America had imposed upon it in response to its aggression in China is debatable. Japan had two options available to her other than attacking the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. First, it could have negotiated an end to her 4-year-long war with China, which Japan was unwilling to do, or it could have simply seized the oil and mineral riches of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, and the Malay Peninsula directly without involving America at all. Consider for a moment that if the US was unwilling to go to war in Europe to assist Great Britain in its struggle with Nazi Germany, what were the chances Congress could have been persuaded to take on the Japanese over the Dutch East Indies and Malaysia? Number 5.
Okay, I didn't know much about that one. I never heard that people believe that that's why the Japanese attacked. So that's interesting. Obviously, you have choices in everything, and they just made that choice. And I do believe I saw a story or read a story that a Japanese official, thought strongly against attacking the United States because he knew that if they did that, they were doomed. And ended up being pretty true. They lost. But I didn't know that one. That one was, I never heard of that one before, so.
5. If Lee had won at Gettysburg, the South would have won the Civil War. It is widely believed that the Union victory at Gettysburg in July of 1863 prevented the North from complete collapse, but a careful look at the overall strategic situation at the time demonstrates this to have been unlikely. First, even if Lee had routed Meade's army at Gettysburg, it would have come at considerable cost, especially considering the number of Union troops Lee faced, over 90,000 compared to his own 70,000 men. This means that even if he had been victorious, Lee would have emerged from the battle with a largely exhausted and depleted force left with which to march on Washington almost 100 miles away. Additionally, Gettysburg would have been only the first in a string of obstacles he would have had to overcome as he moved east. Eventually, he would have to retreat back into Virginia in any case, and though he could add another Confederate victory to the long list of victories Lee had enjoyed up to that point in the war, the South simply couldn't match the North's almost unlimited industrial capability and was doomed to eventually lose in any case.
Okay, it doesn't seem reasonable for anybody to believe that if he would have won that one battle, then that would have determined the outcome of the Civil War. Because like he said, 90,000 against 70,000. You can't honestly believe 70,000 people are going to come out of that alive. You're going to lose a lot of men, a lot of resources, a lot of firepower. And then you still have to march on to Washington. You still have multiple battles after that, which will deplete your forces even more every single time. So thinking that one battle could have won the Civil War is kind of silly, to be honest. So I'm not sure why people would think that.
4. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. Most students grow up believing that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, but it did no such thing.
I think I remember learning in school that that's the way we were taught, that was what freed the slaves.
First of all, it only applied to slaves living within the Confederate States, and since the North had no power to enforce the proclamation in those territories not under its direct control, it really had no immediate effect on freeing anyone. In fact, it didn't even free those slaves in the northern states, where slave ownership, while uncommon, was still legal. It was only illegal to buy and sell slaves in the North, not own them. It would take the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, to do that, and it applied throughout the country, not just parts of it. Number 3.
Okay, so I get that. That was the first step, let's say, in freeing the slaves. And, I think another point that he made that a lot of people may or may not realize is that the North, they had slaves too. Some of the most prominent men in history in the United States owned slaves. So you hear that argument a lot from people in the South, who say that, we weren't the only ones that had slaves. The North had slaves too. Apparently it was just illegal to buy and sell them, but you could still own them. So I guess a Emancipation Proclamation was just the first step in leading to freeing of the slaves.
Lindbergh was the first person to fly across the Atlantic. While Lucky Lindy won fame and fortune for his daring solo jaunt across the Atlantic in 1927, he was far from the first to cross the ocean by air. In fact, two British pilots, Alcock and Brown, had made the crossing years earlier in a repurposed RAF bomber. They flew from St. John's, Newfoundland to Galway, Ireland in just under 16 hours in 1919. That flight paved the way for commercial transatlantic aviation and made Lindbergh's future flight possible. Further, just a couple of weeks after the British duo had made their flight, the British airship R-34, with a couple of dozen crew and passengers on board, made a double crossing, taking about 4 days to cross both ways. In fact, by the time Lindbergh made his world-famous crossing, close to 80 men had already made the epic journey. His, however, was done entirely solo, and clocking in at almost 34 hours of straight flying time was a far more challenging and grueling feat.
80 people in front of him, and he's been credited, or people think he's the first one to do it, maybe solo, but yeah, I don't think I remember learning a whole lot about that part of history, so I can't really comment on whether I thought that was true or not, but it's interesting to know that, sometimes the people who are credited with something aren't the first ones to do it, aren't the first ones to invent it, aren't the first ones to accomplish the task. It might just be the marketing of the time of that person that brings them into the spotlight. I don't know, but interesting none the same.
Number 2. Custer's 7th Cavalry was wiped out at Little Bighorn.
I have been to the Little Bighorn and have seen the battlefield where Custer's last stand took place. It's very eerie, to say the least. Very interesting piece of history. And I can say that I did believe that his unit was wiped out at the Little Bighorn, so let's see.
While many assume that Custer's entire command was wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn in June of 1876, the truth is that less than half of the 647 men under his command were killed in the famous battle. The reason for this was twofold. First, some of his men were assigned to drive and guard the lengthy wagon train that followed in the army's wake, and so were too far away at the time to be involved. And secondly, Custer had divided his command between himself and Major Reno in an effort to make a two-pronged attack. Reno's assault, which preceded Custer's by an hour or so, was driven off with heavy casualties, but most of it emerged from the battle intact. It was only those companies that rode with Custer, about 210 men in all, that were entirely wiped out.
Okay. So, while his entire unit under his command wasn't wiped out because they were split up into groups, everybody who was with him at the Battle of the Little Bighorn was wiped out. So I can see why people would think that nobody in his command survived. Nobody in his command that were with him at the time survived. But like what was just stated, there was a two-prong attack. Not all of them were killed, and then another section of his unit were guarding the wagon train that was following, and they weren't wiped out. So on one hand, yes, everybody under his command was wiped out who were with him, but everybody technically under his command was not wiped out.
Number 1. The USA was chiefly responsible for defeating Germany in World War I and World War II.
Now, if you live in the United States and you're American, you probably would argue this over and over because, USA is the best country in the world.
While American material and military support was imperative and likely ensured an eventual Allied victory, it was others who bore the brunt of the fighting against Germany in both wars. In World War I, the US was late to the show, not making it to France in significant numbers until late in 1917. It was the British and French who had been doing all of the fighting up until then, and had battered the Germans by the time the US entered the fray. In the Second World War, things were much the same, with American troops not arriving in theatre until very late in the war. While they fought largely rearguard actions in North Africa and Italy, by the time they landed in force in France in June 1944, the Germans were already reeling from the massive Soviet juggernaut that was rolling over them from the east. In fact, over 80% of all German casualties in World War II came on the Eastern Front. While it was the US that was chiefly responsible for defeating Japan in the Pacific, it was the Soviet Union that did most of the heavy lifting in Europe.
Okay, so that last point, yes, the US in both World War I and World War II did not enter until a lot later than other countries. So it is safe to say that it wasn't the United States who defeated everybody and won World War I and World War II. It's almost like somebody having a hard time opening a jar. They give it to you because they've been working on it for a while. They can't get it open. They give it to you and you quickly just pop it open. And they always say, well, I loosened it for you. It's kind of what happened there. Other countries, France, Great Britain, Russia, or the Soviet Union, did the brunt of the work. They were there from the beginning. They laid siege to the Nazis and Germany and the enemy, and then the U.S. came in later and just kind of finished the job. I'm not saying that the U.S. didn't have a huge part in helping the Allies win, but it wasn't the United States who did it. It was the other countries who were there from the beginning who really laid the hammer down, and then the United States came in and kind of swept up the mess. So very, very interesting. I knew a few of those to be false, just by later being older, learning more about history. But I can say for the most part, most of this is taught in school. I do remember, a few of those and thinking, oh, well, that's true. This is the way it happened. Again, history is one of those things that the victor writes the history books. So it's always skewed one way or the other, depending on who wrote the book or where it came from. I'm sure history in the United States is much different than learning history from if you're in Germany or France or Great Britain, any other countries. So it's hard to distinguish fact from fiction sometimes when dealing with history, because one book would give you these numbers and another book will counter or contradict those numbers and give you these numbers. So I believe going into any history, you have to be open to maybe kind of a range of numbers, or here's what happened and this is what else that happened that helped this first happening. You know where I'm going? I'm having a hard time explaining this, but it's kind of like Sabaton and their music and their songs. They don't put a lot of specific facts into their songs because you get so many different stories. So basically it's an overall story about what happened. And that's kind of the way you need to approach history at times, that this happened. There's proof that this happened. But the very specifics, the number of people killed, the number captured, whatever, you need to be careful when quoting things like that, because there's always going to be another source that contradicts that. So anyway, I love history. I hope you enjoy history. It's fascinating. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And until the next time, I'll catch you later. Bye.